In one city, people suddenly started dancing and couldn't stop. In another, a wall of molasses rushed through the streets faster than a person could run. And decades later, military planners secretly discussed a plan involving fake attacks on American soil. These sound like three different nightmares, but all three really happened. And here's what makes them unsettling. None of these stories sounds believable when you hear them for the first time. The dancing actually happened. The flood killed people. And the military proposal was not a conspiracy theory. It was a documented plan. So how did stories this strange come so close to disappearing? If you enjoy uncovering the strange parts of history that textbooks often skip, subscribe and stay with me because the third story gets seriously uncomfortable. Strasbourg, 1518. A woman stepped into the street and began dancing. That alone sounds harmless, but she kept going for days. Then others joined her. Soon dozens and eventually hundreds were reportedly moving uncontrollably through the city. Nobody seemed to know why. Then something almost unbelievable happened. Instead of simply stopping the dancers, local authorities reportedly decided the best solution was to let them dance it out. Musicians were brought in. A stage was reportedly built. The idea was simple. If they kept dancing, perhaps the illness would burn itself out. But the strange cure appeared to make things worse. More people joined the dancing, and some reportedly collapsed from exhaustion, injuries, or sheer physical strain. Imagine watching your neighbors dance for hours, then days, while having absolutely no idea what was happening to them. And that leaves the biggest question: why? Historians still debate what triggered the outbreak. One theory points to contaminated food and a toxic fungus. Another suggests mass psychological illness caused by extreme fear, stress, and desperate living conditions. But neither explanation completely closes the case. Eventually, the outbreak faded. The dancing stopped, and Strasbourg moved on. But the records left behind created a historical puzzle that still refuses to disappear. A bizarre outbreak had filled the streets. Authorities had made desperate decisions, and nobody could give the city a completely satisfying answer. But the dancing plague was only the beginning. 4 centuries later, another city would face something far more physical and far more deadly. There was no disease, no mysterious behavior, and no warning from the sky. The threat was sitting inside a giant industrial tank. In Boston, 1919, a huge steel tank held more than 2 million gallons of molasses. It stood near homes, businesses, and busy streets. To the people living nearby, it was simply part of the neighborhood. But inside that tank, pressure was building, and nobody realized how catastrophic the next few minutes would become. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, the tank suddenly failed. Millions of gallons of thick molasses burst outward, creating a wave that reportedly reached roughly 15 to 25 feet high in places. It didn't flow like a harmless kitchen syrup. It slammed through the neighborhood with terrifying force. People had almost no time to react. The wave moved through the streets, knocking down buildings, trapping people, and sweeping vehicles and debris along with it. Some victims were buried beneath the thick mass, while rescuers struggled to move through streets that had suddenly become almost impossible to cross. When the disaster finally stopped, 21 people were dead and around 150 were injured. Entire sections of the neighborhood were damaged. But the disaster raised an even bigger question. How could a tank this enormous have failed so catastrophically in the middle of a city? The company that owned the tank initially claimed sabotage was responsible. That explanation sounded convenient. If someone had deliberately caused the failure, the company wouldn't have to answer as many questions about how the tank was built or maintained. But investigators and lawsuits would soon put that story under pressure. The eventual legal battle exposed a much more uncomfortable possibility. The tank itself had serious problems. It had been poorly designed, inadequately tested, and reportedly showed warning signs before the disaster. What looked like an unavoidable catastrophe increasingly looked like something that could have been prevented. The case became a landmark legal battle. More than 100 victims and property owners sued the company, and the court eventually found the company responsible for the disaster. The ruling mattered far beyond Boston. It showed that companies could be held accountable when engineering decisions put ordinary people in danger. The Great Molasses Flood became more than a bizarre disaster. It changed how people thought about industrial safety, accountability, and the hidden risks of putting massive infrastructure beside crowded communities. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. The warning signs were there, but people only understood them after the tank was gone. Two strange events are now behind us. One was a mystery of human behavior. The other was a preventable industrial catastrophe. But the final story is different. There was no accidental outbreak and no collapsing tank. This time, the disturbing part was an idea, written down by the people who were supposed to protect the country. In 1962, the United States was locked in a dangerous Cold War confrontation with Cuba. Behind closed doors, military planners developed a proposal that sounds almost impossible today: create or stage incidents that could be blamed on Cuba, generating public support for military action. The plan had a name: Operation Northwoods. The proposal went far beyond ordinary military deception. It discussed creating incidents that could make Cuba appear responsible, including attacks or violent acts that could be blamed on the Cuban government. The goal was to manufacture a justification for military intervention. The shocking part isn't that someone later imagined it. The shocking part is that it was formally proposed. And the ideas became increasingly disturbing. The documents discussed possibilities involving fabricated terrorist attacks, incidents blamed on Cuba, and even manipulating public opinion to create support for war. These weren't random thoughts scribbled by one person. They appeared within a formal military planning process. There was just one enormous problem. The plan required something even more important than secrecy. It required approval. And that approval never came. The proposal moved through military channels, but it was rejected at the highest level. The operation that could have changed American history was never carried out. For years, almost nobody outside the government knew the proposal existed. The documents remained buried inside classified archives while the Cold War continued, and the public knew nothing about what had been discussed behind closed doors. Then, decades later, the files were finally declassified, and the story changed completely. When the documents became public, the unbelievable part was no longer the conspiracy theory. It was the paperwork. Operation Northwoods existed as an official proposal. It had been written, discussed, and presented within the U.S. military establishment. A plan that sounded fictional had left behind a paper trail. And that may be the strangest lesson of all. History isn't only shaped by what governments, armies, or powerful people actually did. Sometimes it's also shaped by what they considered doing and what was stopped before it happened. The Dancing Plague, the Molasses Flood, and Northwoods are completely different stories, yet they share one unsettling truth. Some of history's most unbelievable chapters were real long before anyone believed them. The past doesn't always disappear because it was forgotten. Sometimes it disappears because, at the time, nobody believed the story was important enough to remember. A city danced until it collapsed. A river of molasses swallowed a neighborhood, and a military plan was written that never became reality. The strangest part of history isn't that these things happened, it's that we almost lost the evidence that they did.